What was your family's most creative punishment? My father believed that women who misbehaved needed to lose a tooth for every offense. By the time I turned 18, my mother was missing half her mouth, and my older sister could barely chew solid food anymore. Dad kept the pliers in a special wooden box on the mantel like they were something to be proud of. He'd inherited them from his father, who'd inherited them from his father before that. 4 generations of keeping our women in line, he'd say, while polishing the metal until it gleamed. My brothers would nod along like this was completely normal, while us girls stayed silent because speaking up counted as misbehavior. The rules for what counted as misbehavior changed depending on Dad's mood. Burning dinner was always 1 tooth. Talking back was 2 teeth. Looking at him wrong when he was drunk could be 3 teeth depending on how drunk he was. Mom had lost her first tooth on their wedding night for crying too loudly. She'd lost 6 more over the years for various infractions like asking for grocery money or suggesting they visit her parents for Christmas. My sister Claire lost her first tooth at 13 for wearing lipstick she'd gotten from a friend at school. Dad had spotted the faint pink residue even after she'd tried to wipe it off in the bathroom. He'd called all of us into the living room for the ceremony like he always did. My brothers held her arms while Dad got his pliers, and Mom just stood there with tears rolling down her face, because crying silently wasn't considered misbehavior, but trying to intervene was worth at least 2 teeth. I learned to be invisible after watching what happened to Claire. Never spoke unless spoken to directly. Never made eye contact. Never did anything that could be interpreted as defiance. But perfection was impossible in our house because Dad would find reasons to punish us, even when we'd done nothing wrong. He'd claim we'd given him a look, or had an attitude in our voice that only he could detect. Mom tried to protect us in small ways without directly defying him. She'd warn us when he was in a particularly bad mood so we could hide in our rooms. She'd take blame for things we'd done, hoping he'd be satisfied with punishing just her. By the time I was 16, she was missing 12 teeth and could barely eat anything harder than soup. She covered her mouth when she talked and never smiled anymore. My sister Claire lost 4 more teeth over the next few years. 1 for coming home 5 minutes past curfew. 1 for getting a B on her report card instead of straight A's. 2 for refusing to quit her after-school job when Dad decided she was getting too independent. She started developing a lisp from the gaps in her mouth, and kids at school called her a hockey player because of all the missing teeth. The ritual was always the same. Dad would announce the infraction at dinner, then make us all gather in the living room. The guilty party would sit in the special chair they'd inherited along with the pliers. My brothers would hold her shoulders. Dad would make a speech about maintaining order and respecting authority while heating the pliers over a candle flame to sterilize them. Then he'd reach into her mouth while she tried not to scream because screaming was another tooth. I made it to 17 without losing any teeth, which Dad said was suspicious. "No woman is that well behaved," he'd mutter while staring at me during dinner. "You're hiding something." He started inventing infractions just to have an excuse. I'd apparently looked at him disrespectfully even though I hadn't looked at him at all. I'd walked too loudly on the stairs. My breathing was aggressive. He was building up to something and everyone knew it. Things changed when our cousin visited from the city and saw Mom's destroyed mouth. She pretended everything was normal during dinner, but I saw her taking pictures when she thought no one was looking. 2 days after she left, we had cops at our door. Someone had reported suspected abuse. Dad was calm as he explained that the women in our family had genetic dental problems, and he showed them forged medical records he'd been preparing for years just in case. After the cops left, Dad called a family meeting. "Someone in this house contacted outsiders," he said while looking directly at me. "That's the ultimate misbehavior." I protested that I hadn't done anything, but he'd already decided I was guilty. 10 teeth, he announced. All at once, tonight. Mom actually gasped out loud, which earned her 2 more teeth for the outburst. That night, they prepared everything while I sat in my room trying not to throw up from fear. 10 teeth would destroy my mouth. I'd look like a monster. I'd never be able to eat normally again. Mom snuck into my room after midnight when Dad was drinking with my brothers. "Run," she whispered through her ruined mouth. "Take Claire and run now while they're distracted." But Claire was too broken to run. She just sat in her room staring at nothing like she always did. I could hear Dad calling my name from downstairs. My brothers were coming up to get me. Mom was crying and begging them to wait until morning, but Dad said justice couldn't wait. They dragged me down to the living room where the chair was waiting. Dad had the pliers ready, and my brothers took their positions. "Open wide," Dad said with a smile that showed all his perfect teeth. "This is what happens when women forget their place in this family." Mom screams like something broke inside her and throws herself sideways into the bookshelf. Books and picture frames crash to the floor in a mess of glass and paper. Dad and my brothers all turn toward the noise at the same time. I don't think, "Just move." I throw my body sideways out of the chair and my shoulder hits the floor hard. I'm crawling before I even register the pain, scrambling across the carpet toward the hallway on my hands and knees. My brother Mark lunges for my ankle, but his fingers just brush my pajama pants. I'm already pulling myself up using the doorframe, already running. I take the stairs 3 at a time and my bare feet barely touch the steps. Dad roars something behind me, but I can't make out the words over the sound of my own breathing. I hit the back door at full speed and don't even try to turn the handle properly. Just slam my whole body against it until it flies open. The cold night air hits my face and arms like a slap. I'm running across our yard in just my pajamas and bare feet. The grass is wet and cold under my feet. I can hear Dad's voice getting closer behind me. I don't look back, just run harder toward the road. My lungs start burning after the first block. The gravel road cuts into my feet and I can feel something warm running between my toes that's probably blood. I keep running anyway because stopping means going back to that chair. I make it 2 streets over before my legs start shaking so bad I have to stop. There's a truck parked along the curb and I duck behind it, pressing my back against the cold metal. My hands shake so badly I almost drop my phone when I pull it from my pajama pocket. I dial 911 and try to whisper, but my voice comes out shaky and too loud. The dispatcher answers and I tell her my address and that I need help right now. She tells me to stay on the line and asks where I am exactly. I describe the truck and the street name that I can barely read in the dark. She says police are 3 minutes away and to stay hidden. She keeps talking to me in this calm voice, asking my name and if I'm hurt. I tell her my feet are bleeding, but that's not the important part. I can hear Dad's truck engine somewhere close, driving slow like he's searching. The sound gets louder and then quieter and then louder again as he circles the blocks. I press myself smaller against the truck's wheel well, trying to disappear. The dispatcher keeps asking me questions about what happened and I answer in whispers, telling her about the pliers and the chair and how I ran. She doesn't sound shocked or like she thinks I'm lying. She just keeps talking in that steady voice and telling me help is almost there. 2 patrol cars turn onto the street with their lights off. I can see them rolling slow toward where I'm hiding. The female officer gets out first and finds me still crouched behind the truck. I'm shivering so hard my teeth are chattering even though it's not that cold. She wraps her jacket around my shoulders while her partner talks into his radio. They position both patrol cars between me and the direction of my house, blocking the view. The female officer asks if I can walk and I nod even though my feet hurt really bad. They help me into the back of one car and the partner calls for an ambulance. The emergency room is bright and too warm after being outside. A doctor named Autumn Wise comes in and starts examining my feet under the lights. She takes pictures of the cuts from the gravel and then notices the old scars on my arms. She asks gentle questions about where those came from while she cleans the gravel out of my cuts with tweezers. I tell her about the ceremonies and how my brothers would hold our arms during the tooth extractions. She doesn't interrupt or act like she doesn't believe me. She just keeps cleaning my feet and taking more pictures of the scars. I find myself telling her everything because she actually listens. I tell her about Mom's missing teeth and Claire's lisp and the wooden box on the mantel. I tell her about the 4 generations and the forged medical records and how Dad was going to take 10 teeth tonight. She finishes bandaging my feet and then sits down on the stool next to the bed. She says she's going to call someone who can help and that I did the right thing by running. A detective shows up around 2 in the morning when I'm still in the emergency room. His name is Jason Manning and he sits in the chair beside my bed with a notebook. He asks me to start from the beginning and explain everything. I tell him about the pliers and the chair and how it's been happening for generations. He doesn't act shocked or like this is too crazy to be real. He just writes everything down and asks specific questions about dates and how many times it happened. He treats my story like it matters instead of like I'm some kid making things up. When I finish talking, he asks about Mom and Claire. He wants to know if they're still at the house. I tell him yes and start crying because I left them there with Dad. Manning says he can send officers to check on them if I want. I'm scared that a welfare check will make everything worse. Dad will know I talked and he'll punish them. But Manning says they'll be careful and just ask to see that everyone is okay. They won't mention me or say why they're really there. I agree because I need to know if Mom and Claire are safe. Manning steps out to make the call and I sit in the hospital bed staring at my bandaged feet. The officers come back about an hour later. Manning returns to my room and sits down again. He says Dad refused to let them inside the house. Dad showed them those fake medical records again and said everyone was asleep and fine. The officers couldn't force their way in without a warrant. Manning's jaw gets tight when he tells me this. He says we need more evidence to get a warrant, but right now the priority is keeping me safe. I ask what happens next and he explains about protective orders and investigations. A victim advocate arrives right when the sun is coming up. His name is Tanner Owens and he's carrying a bag with clothes and toiletries. He sits down and explains that I'll be going to an emergency shelter. The location is confidential, so Dad can't find me there. He breaks down what happens next with protective orders and investigations, making it sound less scary by going through each step. He tells me I'll meet with a judge and probably have to tell my story again. He says it's normal to feel scared, and that he'll be there to help me through each part. The clothes he brought are basic things like jeans and a t-shirt and a toothbrush. Everything feels surreal, like this is happening to someone else and I'm just watching. Tanner drives me to the shelter while the sky is still dark and the streets are empty. The building looks normal from outside, just a regular house in a quiet neighborhood, which I guess is the point so nobody knows it's there. A staff member meets us at the door and leads me upstairs to a small room with a bed, a desk, and a window with bars on it. She shows me how the lock works and hands me the only key. I stand there holding this tiny piece of metal and something breaks inside me because I've never had a door I could lock before. At home, my door didn't even have a lock and Dad would come in whenever he wanted. Now I have this key and nobody can get to me and I sit on the floor and cry. So hard I can't breathe. The staff member sits with me until I calm down and then shows me where the bathroom is and tells me breakfast is at 7. I lock the door after she leaves and test it 3 times to make sure it really works. The room is basic but clean and there's a stack of donated clothes in the closet that mostly fit. I try to sleep but every sound makes me jump because part of me thinks Dad will find me somehow. Morning comes and I go downstairs for breakfast, where there are 4 other women and 2 kids, but nobody asks questions. After breakfast, the staff member whose name is Rita gives me a huge stack of paperwork to fill out. Medical history, insurance information, emergency contacts, safety planning documents. My hand cramps from writing, and some of the questions make me cry again, like the one asking if I feel safe. A nurse comes by to check my feet and change the bandages and take photos of the cuts for documentation. Then I meet with a crisis counselor who has an office in the basement. She tells me her name is Dr. Yoon, and that I don't have to talk about anything I'm not ready to discuss. We sit in silence for most of the session, which feels weird but also kind of okay. She gives me her card and says I can come find her anytime, day or night, if I need to talk. Back in my room, I try calling Claire 3 times, but she doesn't answer. Each time it goes to voicemail, I feel sicker because I don't know if she's okay or if Dad is punishing her for me running. I text her asking if she's safe, but the message just says delivered, not read. My stomach hurts so bad I can barely eat lunch. Manning calls around 6 that evening and asks how I'm doing at the shelter. I tell him about trying to reach Claire, and he says he'll look into it. Then he tells me he contacted Veronica to ask about the photos she took when she visited. I feel guilty dragging her into this, but Manning says she's the one who reported the abuse in the first place, so she's already involved. He asks if I'm okay with him using those photos as evidence, and I say yes because we need proof. Veronica calls Manning back within an hour and says she's sending everything she has. Manning calls me again to say the photos are coming through and there are dozens of them. Veronica took pictures of Mom's mouth from every angle during her visit 2 weeks ago, and they all have timestamps. She also sends screenshots of text messages where Mom tried to explain away the missing teeth as genetic problems, but the messages don't match what's actually visible in the photos. Manning sounds excited in a professional way and says this evidence really helps the case. I feel relieved that someone documented what Dad did, but also scared about what happens next. On day 3, Manning picks me up from the shelter to take me to the courthouse for an emergency protective order hearing. I have to sit in front of a judge and describe the abuse while Dad's lawyer and a court reporter write everything down. My voice shakes so bad I have to repeat myself twice, and at one point I start crying and the judge gives me a break to get water. Manning sits next to me the whole time, and when I finish testifying, the judge grants a temporary order. Dad and my brothers aren't allowed within 500 feet of me or to contact me in any way. The judge says the order is good for 2 weeks, and then we'll have another hearing to make it permanent. I should feel safer, but instead I feel more scared because now Dad knows for sure that I talked. Back at the shelter, Rita helps me set up online classes so I don't fall behind in the school. She gives me a laptop and shows me how to log into the virtual classroom. Having homework feels almost normal, and I spend the afternoon working on algebra problems, which is easier than thinking about everything else. My English teacher sends an email saying she noticed I've been absent and asking if everything is okay. I don't know how to respond, so I just tell her I'm safe now and working on catching up. Her response says she's glad I'm safe and that she's here if I need anything. It makes me realize she probably saw signs that something was wrong but didn't know how to help. Manning comes back on day 5 with news about interviewing neighbors. He talked to the family next door and the couple across the street. Both of them admitted they heard screaming from our house over the years during what they called family discipline. They said they never called anyone because Dad's family has lived here for generations, and people don't interfere in family business. Manning looks frustrated when he tells me this and says that attitude is exactly why abuse continues. But their statements help build the case even if they should have done something sooner. Between day 5 and day 8, I try calling Claire every day, but she never answers. Then finally I get a text from her that just says I'm scared. I try calling immediately, but Dad answers her phone. He doesn't say anything, just breathes into the phone for a few seconds, and then hangs up. My hands are shaking when I call Manning to tell him what happened. He says this gives him cause to request another welfare check with more authority, and possibly get Child Protective Services involved. He tells me not to try calling Claire again because it might make things worse. On day 8, Veronica drives 3 hours from the city to visit me at the shelter. She brings her parents, who are my Aunt Haley and Uncle Gerard. I haven't seen them in years because Dad didn't like us having contact with Mom's side of the family. They hug me carefully like I might break, and Aunt Haley cries while holding my face in her hands. Uncle Gerard keeps saying he's sorry they didn't know and didn't help sooner. Veronica tells me I can come stay with them in the city if I want, and that their door is always open. The offer makes me cry because I didn't know I had anywhere else to go. Manning shows up at the shelter that same afternoon to interview Veronica in person about what she observed during her visit. They sit in the common room while I wait upstairs, and afterward Manning comes to tell me what she said. Veronica described how Mom covered her mouth constantly when she talked and barely ate any solid food at dinner. She said she suspected something was wrong, but didn't realize how bad it was until she saw Mom's teeth up close. She's been feeling guilty for not acting sooner, even though Manning tells her she did the right thing by documenting everything and reporting it. Veronica took those photos because she knew nobody would believe the truth without proof, and now that proof might be what saves Mom and Claire. The next morning, Manning calls to say the prosecutor wants to meet with me. Her name is Sinead Hunter, and she arrives at the shelter 2 hours later carrying a thick file folder and a laptop bag. We sit in the same conference room where I gave my first statement, and she spreads photos across the table between us. Photos of Mom's mouth, photos of Claire's mouth, photos of the pliers and the chair that Manning took when he responded to my 911 call. Hunter explains they're building a case for aggravated assault and child abuse charges against Dad. She doesn't sugarcoat anything. The forged medical records make it harder because Dad's been planning his defense for years. But Veronica's photos and the neighbor statements are starting to create a pattern of evidence that contradicts his genetic disease story. She asks if I'm willing to testify in court if it comes to that. I tell her yes, even though the thought makes me want to throw up. 2 weeks after I ran, Manning gets a warrant to examine the pliers and the chair as potential evidence. He calls to tell me Dad's lawyer tried to block the search, claiming their family heirlooms protected as personal property. But the judge allowed it based on my testimony and the photographic evidence Veronica provided. Manning sounds excited in a way I haven't heard before. He says this could be the break they need. Crime scene technicians process the pliers and chair at the police lab. Manning meets me at the shelter 3 days later to explain what they found. Traces of blood and biological material on the pliers that match multiple DNA profiles. He needs samples from Mom and Claire to confirm, but this physical evidence is huge for the case. It proves the pliers were used on multiple people, which contradicts Dad's story about normal dental procedures. I ask how they'll get samples from Mom and Claire when they're still at the house. Manning says they're working on it. My first full therapy session happens that same week. The shelter has a therapist who comes twice a week, and I've been avoiding her because talking about everything feels impossible. But she sits down across from me in the small office and waits patiently until I start crying. I cry about leaving Mom and Claire behind, about running while they stayed in that house, about being safe while they're still in danger. The therapist lets me cry for a long time before she speaks. She explains that I didn't abandon them. I took the only action available to survive. And me surviving might ultimately help them too, because now there's a witness who escaped and can testify. Her words don't make the guilt disappear, but they make it slightly easier to breathe. Manning finally gets approval for a welfare check that involves a social worker instead of just patrol officers. He calls me right after they visit the house. They found Claire unresponsive and dissociated in her room. She wouldn't speak or make eye contact. The social worker determined she needs immediate mental health evaluation and called for an ambulance to transport her to a psychiatric facility. I'm relieved she's getting help, but terrified about what Dad did to her after I left. Mom gets interviewed separately during the same welfare check. Manning says she initially stuck to Dad's story about genetic dental problems and normal family discipline. But when the social worker told her Claire was hospitalized and that I was safe at an undisclosed location, Mom broke down completely. She admitted to years of abuse, described the extraction rituals, showed them her destroyed mouth, but she's terrified of the consequences of speaking up. She told them Dad will kill her if she testifies against him. Manning asks if I want to talk to Mom, but I'm not ready yet. Hunter arranges for Mom to meet with a domestic violence specialist who works with the prosecutor's office. The specialist visits Mom at the house when Dad is at work. She explains safety planning and legal protections available to abuse victims. Mom is resistant at first. Years of conditioning make her believe she deserves the abuse or that leaving is impossible. But the specialist doesn't push. She just provides information and a phone number Mom can call anytime, day or night. Manning tells me this is progress even though it doesn't feel like much. 3 weeks after my escape, Claire gets released from psychiatric hold. But she doesn't go back to Dad's house. Manning arranged for her to be placed in a therapeutic group home that specializes in trauma recovery. He calls to tell me she's stable but not ready to talk about the abuse yet. Pushing her could set back her recovery. I ask when I can see her and he says soon. The group home allows supervised visits after Claire settles in. I visit Claire 5 days later with a staff member sitting nearby in the common room. Claire looks smaller than I remember. Her hair is pulled back in a messy ponytail and she's wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt that's too big for her. We sit together on a couch without talking much. She's on medication that makes her seem foggy and distant. But when I tell her I'm safe and living with Aunt Haley and Uncle Gerard, she squeezes my hand. It's a small gesture, but it feels like a connection we haven't had in years. I tell her I love her and she nods but doesn't say it back. The staff member says that's normal and not to take it personally. Manning interviews my brothers separately about the extraction rituals. He tells me their stories contradict each other in small ways that suggest they're not following a rehearsed script Dad prepared. One brother describes holding Mom's shoulders during a ceremony that happened in spring. The other brother says that same ceremony happened in fall. Small details that don't match up. Then one of my brothers admits something Manning didn't expect. He says he hated holding us down, but was afraid of becoming a target himself if he refused. Dad had threatened to extract his teeth too if he didn't participate in family discipline. Manning says this confession might be useful because it shows Dad used fear to control everyone in the house, not just the women. 2 days later, Manning calls to tell me Dad got arrested that morning at his work. The charges are assault and child endangerment based on the DNA evidence from the pliers and all the witness statements my brothers gave. His bail hearing is set for the next day, and Manning says the prosecutor is asking for a high amount because Dad has shown he's willing to use violence to control his family. I ask what happens if he makes bail, and Manning explains there will be a no-contact order that legally prevents him from coming near me or Mom or Claire. A piece of paper doesn't feel like much protection against someone who spent years pulling teeth out of people's mouths, but Manning says violating the order means immediate arrest. The bail gets set at $50,000, which sounds like a lot, but Dad's family has money from the farm they've owned for generations. Manning tells me not to worry because even if he posts bail, the no-contact order is serious and police will be watching. I want to believe him, but I've spent 17 years learning that rules don't apply to Dad the same way they apply to everyone else. The next morning, I wake up to staff members rushing around the shelter looking stressed and angry. Someone spray-painted liar in huge red letters across the front wall during the night. The shelter director pulls me aside to show me security footage on her computer, and there's a truck that looks exactly like the one my oldest brother drives circling the block 3 times before someone gets out wearing a hoodie. You can't see their face, but the way they walk reminds me of my brother, and my stomach drops because it means they know where I am. The director says they're moving me to a different shelter across town as a safety measure, and I need to pack my stuff right away. I'm so tired of being disrupted and moved around like I'm the one who did something wrong. This is the third place I've stayed in 4 weeks, and I barely remember what it feels like to sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row. The new shelter is smaller and older with peeling paint in the hallways, but the room has a window that actually opens, which the last place didn't have. Manning comes by that afternoon to check on me and brings news about a forensic dentist who examined all the photographs Veronica took of Mom's mouth, plus some pictures the hospital took of Claire during her psychiatric evaluation. The dentist wrote a detailed report explaining that the damage to their teeth is consistent with traumatic extraction using pliers or similar tools. He specifically noted the fracture patterns and tissue damage that you don't see with normal tooth loss or genetic conditions. Manning says this expert testimony will counter Dad's forged medical records, because you can't fake the physical evidence of trauma. The report describes force marks on the surrounding bone structure and damage to the jaw that happens when teeth are pulled without proper technique. Reading the clinical descriptions of what Dad did to Mom and Claire makes me feel sick, but also validated because someone with credentials is finally saying this wasn't normal dental problems. 3 days after the expert report gets filed, Mom calls Manning and says she's ready to give a formal statement. He arranges for me to listen on speakerphone from his office while she talks to him, and a stenographer who types everything. Mom's voice sounds flat and distant, like she's reading someone else's story instead of her own, but she gets through the whole thing without stopping. She describes losing her first tooth on her wedding night because she cried too loud when Dad hurt her. She lists every extraction after that with dates and reasons, and her voice never changes tone even when she's talking about the worst ones. The stenographer's fingers fly across the keys, making clicking sounds that fill the silence between Mom's sentences. She talks for almost 2 hours, covering 18 years of abuse, and when she finishes, Manning thanks her and tells her she did great. After the call ends, he looks at me and says, "Mom's statement combined with the expert testimony and the physical evidence makes a strong case." Hunter files upgraded charges the next week, including aggravated assault with a weapon and child abuse, and witness intimidation based on the phone incident where Dad called Claire's phone. Dad's lawyer tries to argue the pliers are just a tool, not a weapon, but Hunter shows pictures of the pliers next to the dental damage and explains how they were used to inflict harm. The judge denies the motion to dismiss and sets a preliminary hearing date for 2 weeks out. Manning explains this means the case is moving forward, and Dad will have to answer to all the charges in court. A week later, I have to testify before a grand jury, which Manning says is a group of regular people who decide if there's enough evidence to indict someone. The courthouse is huge and intimidating with marble floors and high ceilings that make every sound echo. Tanner meets me in the waiting room and sits with me while I try not to throw up from nerves. He reminds me I'm just telling the truth about what happened, and the grand jury needs to hear my story to understand why Dad needs to face charges. When they call me in, I walk into a room full of strangers sitting in rows looking at me, and my hands start shaking. The prosecutor asks me questions about the pliers and the chair and the ceremonies, and I answer each one as clearly as I can. I describe the night I ran and the 10 teeth Dad planned to take, and how Mom created a distraction so I could escape. Some of the grand jury members look upset, and one woman in the back row wipes her eyes. But I keep talking because Tanner said getting through this is important. The whole testimony takes about 40 minutes, and when I'm done, the prosecutor thanks me and says I can go. Tanner is still waiting in the hallway, and he tells me I did really well, even though I felt like I was going to pass out the whole time. 2 days later, Manning calls with news that the grand jury returned indictments against Dad on multiple felony counts. They also indicted both my brothers as accomplices for their role in holding us down during the extractions. My brother's lawyer contacts Hunter immediately to negotiate a plea deal where they'll testify against Dad in exchange for reduced charges. Manning says this is good because their testimony will show the pattern of abuse and how Dad controlled the whole family through fear and violence. Claire's therapist calls me that same afternoon to say Claire had a major setback after learning about the indictments. She stopped eating 3 days ago and keeps saying Dad is going to kill her for talking to the police even though he's in jail and can't get to her. The therapist and staff are working with her around the clock, trying to help her understand the legal system is protecting her, not punishing her. They're using medication to help with her anxiety, and slowly she's starting to eat small amounts of food again. Hearing about Claire's setback makes me feel guilty for starting this whole process, even though I know rationally that running away was the only choice I had. Manning arranges for Aunt Haley and Uncle Gerard to take me in since the shelter is only meant for short-term stays. They drive down to pick me up and help me pack my few belongings into their car. The drive to the city takes 2 hours, and I watch the rural landscape turn into suburbs and then tall buildings. Their house is in a quiet neighborhood with sidewalks and streetlights and other houses close by, which feels strange after growing up isolated. They set me up in their spare bedroom and tell me to make myself at home, but I don't know how to relax in a space that feels this safe. The anonymity of the city is weird after years of living in a small town where everyone knew everyone. I catch myself looking over my shoulder when I walk to the corner store, even though nobody here knows who I am or what happened. Uncle Gerard helps me enroll in the local high school, and we meet with a counselor to figure out my credits. She pulls up my transcript on her computer and asks questions about what classes I've taken and what I still need to graduate. She doesn't ask why I transferred in the middle of the year, or make me explain my situation, which I appreciate more than sympathy would mean. We work out a schedule that will let me finish on time if I take an extra English class and do credit recovery for the weeks I missed. The counselor prints out my new schedule and a map of the school and tells me to come find her if I need anything. Walking out of her office, I feel like maybe I can actually do this and have a normal senior year, even though nothing about my life is normal anymore. Manning calls me 2 days after I start at the new school to say Mom finally agreed to testify against Dad. She took an immunity deal in exchange for her full cooperation with the prosecution, and they're moving her into transitional housing with support services built in. The Victim Compensation Fund approved her application for dental reconstruction, which means she can start getting implants to replace the teeth Dad took over the years. Manning sounds pleased when he tells me this because Mom's testimony will be crucial for the case, and having her as a cooperative witness instead of a hostile one changes everything. He also mentions that one of my brothers accepted a plea deal that morning. The deal includes 3 years probation, mandatory therapy sessions twice a week, and testimony against Dad at trial. My other brother is still holding out and refusing to cooperate, but his lawyer keeps pressuring him because the evidence is strong, and going to trial as Dad's accomplice could mean actual prison time. Manning says the prosecutor is giving him another week to decide before they stop offering deals and proceed with full charges against both brothers. That night, I wake up at 3 a.m, soaking wet with sweat, because I dreamed I was back in the chair with Dad's hands reaching for my mouth. My heart pounds so hard I can feel it in my throat, and for a few seconds I don't know where I am. Aunt Haley must hear me moving around because she appears in my doorway wearing her bathrobe and asks if I'm okay without turning on the light. I tell her I had a bad dream, and she comes in and sits on the edge of my bed without saying anything else. She doesn't ask what the dream was about or try to make me talk through it. She just sits there in the dark, being present and solid and real, until my breathing slows down and the panic fades. This becomes our routine over the next few weeks because the nightmares come back several times a week, and she always hears me and always comes to sit until I'm calm again. Manning arranges a video call so I can talk to Claire after she gets discharged from the group home to a foster family that specializes in trauma recovery. When her face appears on the screen, she looks more present than I've seen her in years. Her eyes focus on me instead of staring through me at nothing, and when I tell her about my new school and how different the city is from home, she actually smiles. It's a small smile and it doesn't last long, but seeing any expression on her face besides blank emptiness makes me want to cry. She tells me the foster family has 2 other girls who've been through bad situations, and they all eat dinner together every night and nobody yells. Her therapist sits just off camera during our call but doesn't interrupt, and Claire seems comfortable enough to keep talking for 20 minutes about small normal things like the classes she's taking and a cat the foster family has. 4 months pass faster than I expected while I settle into the routine of school and therapy and living with Aunt Haley and Uncle Gerard. Then Manning calls to say Dad's trial date is set, and I need to come back to testify in person. Tanner drives up to the city to accompany me to the courthouse, and Hunter spends 3 hours preparing me for cross-examination in a conference room that smells like old coffee. She warns me that Dad's lawyer will try to make me look like a liar who invented everything for attention or to get back at Dad for normal discipline. She tells me to stay calm no matter what he says, and just repeat the facts clearly without getting emotional or defensive. The morning I have to take the witness stand, I throw up twice before we even leave for the courthouse. Tanner stays close beside me as we walk through the metal detectors and up to the courtroom on the 3rd floor. Dad sits at the defense table in a suit I've never seen before, looking calm and almost respectable. When I walk to the witness stand, his eyes lock onto mine and I feel like I'm back in our living room about to sit in that chair. Hunter told me to focus on her face when I testify, so I force myself to look away from Dad and find her standing near the jury box. She asks me to state my name and age and then walks me through the night I ran, starting with Mom's warning and ending with hiding behind the truck. Dad's lawyer objects twice, but the judge overrules him both times. Then the defense lawyer stands up for cross-examination and suggests I'm making everything up because I was mad about normal house rules. He asks why I never told a teacher or called police before if things were really so bad. I don't get angry like he wants me to. I just explain calmly that speaking up was misbehavior worth 2 teeth, and I was too scared to risk it. He tries 3 more times to trip me up or make me contradict myself, but I stick to exactly what happened without adding or changing anything. Mom testifies after me and describes her wedding night in detail that makes 2 jurors look down at their hands. She explains how Dad heated the pliers over a candle and told her crying loudly was disrespectful to him. Her voice stays flat and emotionless like she's reading a grocery list, but when she opens her mouth to show the jury her destroyed teeth, several people shift in their seats. Dad's lawyer suggests she's lying to avoid criminal charges of her own for not protecting us, but her mouth is right there as evidence that speaks louder than any accusation he can make. The forensic dentist testifies next and brings enlarged photographs showing force marks on extracted teeth and trauma to surrounding tissue. He explains why the damage patterns couldn't possibly be caused by genetic disease or poor dental care, and points out specific indicators of violent extraction. One photograph shows a tooth root with visible tool marks, and the jury looks disturbed enough that the judge calls a brief recess. My brother, who took the plea deal, testifies about being 12 years old the first time Dad made him hold Mom's shoulders during an extraction. He cries on the stand while describing how Dad threatened to extract his teeth if he refused to help, and said real men protect family order. Watching him break down, I realize for the first time that he was a victim too, even though he hurt us. Dad controlled him through fear the same way he controlled Mom and Claire and me. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it makes me understand that Dad destroyed more than just our teeth. Claire provides her testimony through a video link from a private room at her foster home with her therapist sitting beside her just out of frame. She describes years of abuse in a voice so quiet the judge asks her twice to speak up. She's fragile but clear about specific incidents and dates. When Dad's lawyer tries to question her competency and suggests her mental health issues make her an unreliable witness, the judge shuts him down immediately and tells him to move on to his next question. Veronica takes the stand next and explains how she noticed Mom covering her mouth during dinner and barely touching her food. She describes taking photos in the bathroom when Mom showed her the missing teeth because she wanted to document what she saw, but wasn't sure what to do with the evidence. The defense lawyer asks why she waited 2 days to call police if she was so concerned, and Veronica admits she was scared of making things worse for us. She says she spent those 2 days researching abuse reporting and trying to decide if intervention would help or just make Dad angrier. I understand her hesitation completely, because I lived with that same calculation every single day. Hunter asks her to describe Mom's condition in detail, and Veronica explains that 12 missing teeth isn't something you see from poor dental care or genetics. She says Mom could barely chew and spoke with a lisp and seemed terrified the whole visit. The defense tries to suggest Veronica has a grudge against Dad from some family conflict, but she calmly states she barely knew him before the visit, and only acted because what she witnessed seemed criminal. The defense presents their case next, and Dad's lawyer shows the forged medical records to the jury, while calling a dentist who testifies about genetic conditions that can cause tooth loss. This dentist explains various diseases and disorders that affect teeth, and admits it's theoretically possible for multiple family members to have similar dental problems. But when Hunter cross-examines him, she asks if he ever personally examined any of us, and he admits he never met us. She asks if the medical records show any actual genetic testing or just claims of family history, and he acknowledges there's no lab work. Hunter shows him the forensic photos of extracted teeth with tool marks, and asks if genetic disease leaves metal scraping on tooth roots. He admits it doesn't. She asks if genetic conditions cause trauma to surrounding gum tissue consistent with forced extraction, and he says no. By the end of his testimony, the defense's medical expert has basically confirmed that our injuries don't match any natural disease process. The trial runs for 3 full days with both sides presenting evidence and calling witnesses. Hunter's closing argument walks the jury through every piece of physical evidence, starting with the pliers that have 4 different DNA profiles on them. She describes the photos of our mouths and the forensic analysis of trauma patterns. She reminds them of testimony from me and Mom and Claire and my brother, who all described the same ritual in the same chair with the same tools. She explains that the defense wants them to believe in an impossible coincidence, where 3 women in one family all developed identical dental problems, that somehow required the father to keep extraction pliers as a family heirloom. She tells them the evidence proves systematic violence beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense's closing argument claims we're all lying to escape consequences for our own failures, and that Dad is a traditional father being persecuted for maintaining family discipline. His lawyer suggests the DNA on the pliers could be from legitimate dental emergencies, where Dad helped during actual medical crises. He points to the medical records as proof of genetic problems, and argues that the prosecution is criminalizing a father's attempts to help his family. The jury gets the case after lunch on the 3rd day, and we all wait in a victim conference room while they think it over. Tanner brings sandwiches, but I can't eat anything because my stomach is twisted in knots. Mom sits very still staring at her hands, and I wonder what she's thinking after spending so many years believing this was normal. 6 hours later, the bailiff calls us back to the courtroom because the jury has reached a verdict. My legs shake walking back into that room, and I have to focus on breathing normally. The jury foreman stands up when the judge asks if they've reached a verdict and says they have. The judge asks about the first count of aggravated assault, and the foreman says guilty. The second count of aggravated assault gets the same answer. Child abuse guilty. Witness intimidation guilty. The foreman reads guilty 12 times for 12 different charges, and Dad just sits there with no expression on his face like he's watching a boring movie. I feel something loosen in my chest that's been tight and hard for years. It's not happiness exactly because there's too much damage for happiness, but it's relief that someone finally believed us. The judge thanks the jury and sets a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks from today. Hunter catches up with us in the hallway and asks if I want to give a victim impact statement at sentencing. I'm scared of being in the same room with Dad again and having to speak while he stares at me, but I also want him to hear directly from me how his actions destroyed our family and took away our ability to feel safe. I tell Hunter I'll do it, and she says she'll help me prepare a statement that covers what I want to say. Mom decides she wants to give a statement too, and Hunter explains that Claire can submit a written statement that the prosecutor will read since she's not ready to attend in person. The 2 weeks pass in a strange blur where I'm living at Aunt Haley's house going to my new school, but my mind is stuck on what I'm going to say at sentencing. I write about 15 different versions of my statement before I find words that feel true. Aunt Haley helps me practice reading it out loud so I don't freeze up in court. The sentencing hearing is in the same courtroom, and I sit in the front row with Mom while we wait for the judge to come in. Dad is brought in wearing jail clothes, and he looks thinner than I remember, but his face still has that same cold expression. The judge asks if any victims want to make statements before sentencing, and Hunter calls me first. I walk to the podium with my paper shaking in my hands and start reading about how I learned to make myself invisible in my own house. I describe never knowing which version of Dad would come home each night and how I still flinch when I hear loud voices or heavy footsteps. I explain that I can't eat dinner with other people without feeling panic, because dinner was when Dad would announce who was getting punished. My voice cracks a few times, but I get through the whole thing while Dad stares at me with no emotion. Mom reads her statement next about losing her ability to smile and eat normally, and how she covered her mouth for years because she was ashamed. She talks about her wedding night, and how she thought marriage was supposed to be about love and partnership, but instead she got violence and control. Hunter reads Claire's statement, which describes years of abuse and how she still has nightmares about the chair and the pliers. Claire wrote that she's working on recovery but doesn't know if she'll ever feel completely safe again. The judge listens to all three statements without interrupting, and then asks Dad if he wants to say anything before sentencing. Dad stands up and says he was just maintaining family order the way his father taught him, and that modern society has lost respect for traditional family structures. He doesn't apologize or show any understanding that he hurt us. The judge's face gets hard, and she tells Dad that his actions constitute torture, and that no tradition justifies systematic violence against family members. She sentences him to 15 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation, with mandatory anger management and mental health treatment. She orders him to pay money for our dental work and therapy, though Hunter warned us we probably won't see much of that. My brother, who testified and took the plea deal, gets probation with intensive supervision and mandatory therapy. The judge says she considered his age when Dad started forcing him to participate, and the control Dad had over him. My other brother, who refused to cooperate, gets 3 years in prison as an accomplice. The judge tells him he made choices to participate, even though he was also a victim of Dad's control, and those choices have consequences. After sentencing, Tanner meets with Mom and me to help us apply for victim compensation funds that will cover dental work and therapy and some living expenses. The paperwork is overwhelming, with dozens of forms asking for detailed information about the abuse and our financial situation. Tanner walks us through every single form and explains what each section means and why they need that information. Just knowing there's financial support available makes recovery feel more real and possible instead of some distant idea. Mom starts the dental reconstruction process the following week with a specialist who works with abuse survivors. The specialist explains that Mom will need implants to replace the missing teeth, which will take several months of appointments and procedures. Mom cries during the consultation, but the specialist says those are normal tears, because getting treatment means acknowledging what happened and starting to heal. Just having a treatment plan gives Mom hope for the first time in years, and she calls me that night to say she's scheduled her first implant surgery. I start therapy twice a week with a counselor who works with abuse survivors. The sessions happen in a small office with soft chairs and a box of tissues that gets used more than I expected. My therapist asks me to talk about my brothers and how I feel about their roles and what happened. I tell her I'm angry at them for holding us down, but also confused because they were scared of Dad too. She helps me understand that I can recognize they were victims while still holding them responsible for choosing to participate instead of refusing or getting help. This idea feels complicated and uncomfortable, but also true in a way that makes sense. We spend weeks working through these feelings, and I cry during most sessions, but afterward I feel lighter, like I've set down something heavy I'd been carrying. My therapist never pushes me to forgive anyone or move on faster than I'm ready. She just listens and asks questions that help me figure out what I actually think versus what I was taught to think. Claire moves to a long-term therapeutic foster home about a month after sentencing. The foster parents specialize in helping kids who've been through serious trauma, and they have experience with the kind of damage our family did. She starts attending a special school designed for trauma survivors, where the classes are smaller, and the teachers understand why she might have trouble concentrating or need to leave the room sometimes. She calls me every Sunday afternoon, and we talk about normal things like TV shows we're watching and songs we heard on the radio. These conversations feel strange at first because we never just talked about regular stuff before. Everything in our house was always tense and careful. But slowly we build a different kind of relationship that isn't only about shared pain. She tells me about a girl at her school who's teaching her to paint, and I tell her about a book I'm reading for English class. The calls are short because talking still tires her out, but they matter more than long conversations would. 6 months after the trial, I get my report card and see that I made honor roll for the first time ever. All A's and B's when I used to get C's and D's because I was too scared and tired to focus on schoolwork. Aunt Haley sees the grades and immediately says we're going out to celebrate. She takes me to a restaurant where I order whatever I want without worrying about the price, and she tells me she's proud of how hard I've worked to build a new life. I feel embarrassed by the praise because I don't think I did anything special. I just went to the school and did my homework. But she says that doing normal things after trauma isn't easy, and I should recognize my own strength. The dinner feels good in a quiet way that's different from big dramatic moments. Just sitting in a restaurant eating good food and talking about my future, like I actually have one. Mom sends me a photo one afternoon showing her smiling with her mouth full of new teeth. The first phase of her dental reconstruction is complete, and she looks completely different. Younger somehow and lighter, like years of weight lifted off her shoulders. She can eat solid food again without pain, and she doesn't cover her mouth when she talks anymore. The text with the photo says she started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter helping other women who are trying to leave dangerous situations. She meets with them one-on-one and shares her story so they know recovery is possible even when everything feels hopeless. I call her after seeing the photo and she sounds happier than I've heard in years. She talks about the women she's helping and how good it feels to turn her experience into something useful. I tell her I'm proud of her and mean it completely. My school counselor helps me start applying to colleges during my senior year. We focus on schools that have strong support services for students with trauma histories, because I know I'll need help adjusting to college life. The counselor shows me information about campus counseling centers and student support groups and schools with programs specifically for survivors. A year ago, the idea of going to college felt impossible, like something that happened to other people, but not to girls like me. Now it feels like a real future I can actually work toward. I fill out applications and write essays about overcoming challenges and request transcripts from my old school. The process is overwhelming with deadlines and requirements, but the counselor breaks everything into small steps. Each application I submit feels like proof that I'm building something new. Claire visits me and Aunt Haley for a weekend in early spring. Her foster parents drive her to the city and drop her off Friday evening. We spend the weekend doing normal sister things like watching movies on the couch and baking cookies that turn out slightly burned but taste good anyway. She's still in therapy and taking medication for anxiety and depression, but she seems more present than before. More like a person and less like a ghost. Saturday night we're watching a comedy and I make some stupid joke about the main character, and Claire actually laughs. A real laugh that sounds surprised, like she forgot she could do that. The sound is so beautiful I almost cry, but I don't because I don't want to make the moment weird. We just keep watching the movie and eating our burned cookies and being sisters in a way we never got to be before. Manning calls on a Tuesday to tell me that Dad filed an appeal of his conviction. His lawyer warned us this would probably happen because convicted people almost always appeal. Hunter gets on the phone too and explains that the appeal likely won't succeed because the evidence against Dad was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, expert testimony, all of it pointing to systematic abuse over years. But the appeal means the case isn't completely over yet. There will be more legal proceedings and possibly another hearing where we might have to testify again. I feel my stomach drop when Manning tells me this because I thought we were done. I thought sentencing meant it was finished and we could move forward. But apparently legal cases don't end cleanly like I hoped. They drag on with appeals and motions and more waiting. Manning promises to keep me updated on everything and says I probably won't have to testify again, but he can't guarantee it. After the call, I sit in my room feeling tired in a deep way that sleep won't fix. My English teacher assigns an essay about overcoming adversity, and I decide to write about my experience escaping abuse. I don't use real names or identifying details, but I write about the fear and the running and the slow process of building a new life. The teacher reads it and asks if she can submit it to a writing contest for survivors. I agree, even though the idea of strangers reading my story makes me nervous. A few months later, I find out I didn't win the contest, but my essay gets published in a collection of survivor stories. Seeing my words in print feels strange and powerful at the same time. I read the essay 3 times trying to recognize myself in the story, and realize I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm not proud exactly, but I'm not hiding either. What happened to me was real and wrong, and now it's documented in a way that might help someone else feel less alone. Mom calls me one evening crying, but the tears sound happy instead of sad. She just got her final dental implants placed, and the dentist cleared her to eat whatever she wants. She tells me she ate an apple that afternoon for the first time in years. A whole apple with the skin on, biting through it like a normal person without pain or difficulty. She cries telling me this, and I cry listening because something as simple as eating an apple represents so much more than food. She also mentions she started dating someone she met at the domestic violence shelter support group, a man who left his own abusive marriage and understands what recovery looks like. She's taking things very slowly because trust is hard after what Dad did, but she's allowing herself to imagine a different kind of relationship, one based on respect instead of fear. I tell her I'm happy for her and I mean it, even though part of me worries she'll get hurt again. But she's an adult making her own choices, and all I can do is support her. On the 1-year anniversary of my escape, I visit the shelter where I first stayed after running from Dad. The staff members remember me and hug me carefully, asking how I'm doing. I thank them for helping me that first terrible night when I showed up barefoot and shaking. They tell me they're glad I'm safe now and ask about my plans for the future. Tanner happens to be at the shelter meeting with a new client, and he comes over to say hello. He tells me I was brave for running and for testifying and for rebuilding my life. I shake my head and explain that I wasn't brave at all. I was desperate and terrified and just trying to survive. Sometimes desperation looks like courage from the outside, but it doesn't feel courageous when you're living it. It feels like panic and instinct and doing the only thing possible in an impossible situation. Tanner listens and nods and says that maybe courage and desperation aren't as different as people think. Maybe they're both just different words for refusing to give up. I don't know if I agree, but I appreciate him listening without arguing. We talk for a few more minutes about my school and Claire's progress and Mom's dental work. Then I leave the shelter and walk to Aunt Haley's car, feeling grateful for everyone who helped me get from that desperate night to this ordinary afternoon. A few weeks later, I attend Claire's graduation from her therapeutic school program. The ceremony is small and quiet, with just the students and their families in a community center room decorated with handmade banners. Claire walks across the little stage to accept her certificate, and she's smiling for real. Not the fake smile she used to wear at home. Afterward, she comes over and hugs me tight, something she hasn't done in years. She tells me she's going to regular high school next fall with support services in place, and that she's nervous but ready. Then she says something that makes my chest feel warm. She wants to be a therapist someday to help other kids like us. I tell her she'll be amazing at it, and I mean every word because she understands what it's like in a way most people never will. These days, I'm sleeping through most nights without nightmares, which still surprises me when I wake up and realize I made it through. When I do wake up afraid, heart racing, and hands shaking, I can calm myself down now. I remind myself that I'm safe in Aunt Haley's house. I remind myself that Dad is in prison where he can't hurt anyone. I remind myself that I have people who love me and want me to be okay. The fear doesn't disappear completely, and maybe it never will. But it's not the loudest voice in my head anymore. It's just one voice among many, and I can choose which ones to listen to. That feels like the truest kind of freedom I've ever known.